Good morning. It's been a long time, quite a while, a few years since I've been here at First, but it's a pleasure to be with you this morning, to have the opportunity to preach the gospel, to have the opportunity also to lead in us in a kind of sorrow for Kara and for her family, and for all of the things they're having to deal with at this point. So this day, each day, please keep them and keep her in your prayers. First things first. Over the years, sermon titles have become important to me. They are important because the best titles present up front the theme of the sermon. They give parishioners a clue as to where the sermon is headed. They give you a clue as to how the text is going to be interpreted. So it's important to give a sermon the best title possible. And over the years, I've found that both important and difficult to do. There are times, however, when I get a little help along the way, and this was one of them. Someone comes up with a title that simply cannot be improved upon, and I can cabbage onto that title and make use of it myself. But now I have to put on my other hat, which is as a librarian, and I have to give you the source from which I did the borrowing for this particular title, The Ties That Blind. It came from an article in the periodical U.S. Catholic, which was published in September of 2004. The author is a woman by the name of Alice Camille, a nationally known writer, a religious educator, a graduate of the Berkeley Franciscan School of Theology with her Master of Divinity degree. In this article, Ms. Camille really helped open up for me this very, very difficult passage. Now large crowds were traveling with him, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, even life itself, cannot be my disciple." There it is. There it is. And it's a tough one. Over the centuries, people of faith, including preachers, some of whom have faith, I've discovered over the years, have a real hard time with this particular passage. In part because these words from Jesus seem so terribly contradictory. This is the same Jesus who said, let the little children come unto me. The same Jesus who had such a high and holy view of marriage that divorce was almost totally excluded as a possibility. The same Jesus who had an equally high regard for the Ten Commandments, particularly the one about honoring one's parents. So over the years, along with a lot of people, other people, I have wondered how it was that these words could come from Jesus' mouth. And what did he possibly mean? Well, we all develop our own ideas, and fairly recently I have had an idea which has sort of grown out of the context in which these words in Luke were spoken. We have to remember that Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, and he knows what is going to happen to him there. He is going to go to the temple, He is going to offend the religious leaders. He is going to overturn the tables of the money changers. He's going to ruffle the feathers of the Roman authorities. Those are the ones who were always on the lookout for anyone who might possibly want to start a rebellion against Rome. Now, maybe, just maybe in this context, Jesus was really trying to protect his followers. Maybe he was saying, in effect, think about the price you will pay for following me. I'm going to Jerusalem. I am going to confront the religious leaders. Rome will probably see me as a threat to their control of Judah. If you follow me, you risk getting killed. I don't want that to happen to you. If you follow me, the decision will be seen as rejecting your parents, rejecting your spouses, rejecting your children. After all, the man who builds a tower has to first consider if he has the resources to complete that tower. If he doesn't, people are going to say, "Ha, look at him. He thought he could do it, and he can't." How about that king who decides he's going to go into battle against another king? But the other king has 20,000 troops, and this king only has 10,000 troops. Maybe the wise thing to do would be to try and make for peace and try and send emissaries to the king before he comes to confront in battle. You see, with this view, Jesus is trying to protect his followers, trying to shield them from the consequences of following him. And maybe that's what he had in mind. Maybe, but I doubt it. Alice Camille has some guidance for us here. She makes the following observation. Culturally, Jesus used the Semitic idiom for hating our family members because he was combating a societal view that scholars call amoral familialism. Amoral familialism. Camille says this nasty term described a social system that prized kinship so highly that any offense against a member of one's family immediately became an offense against the entire family. And the entire family had an obligation to avenge that offense. And avenge it they would, sometimes even to death. Now, the Old Testament uses the phrase an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This is known as lex talionis, or the law of retaliation. This law dictated that punishment for an offense should be no more than equivalent to the crime which was committed. Amoral familialism simply did not stop there. Again, in the words of Camille, this mindset inhabited a culture that has an unacceptable expression of a family's indignation. It made an idol of the family, as God's law was subordinated to a family's outsized sense of honor. And again, she says, in a culture that thought perhaps too highly of family, Jesus used the most inflammatory language he could to check it. Don't prize your obligation to family more than to God's own law. hate your family and follow me. It was a scalding challenge to the way that things worked, and it was meant to be that kind of challenge. Our obligation to God and to God's laws exceeds, this is saying, even our obligations to family. And that, I submit, is a sobering thought for us. It's not a thought that we really want to face, and fortunately, we don't have to face it very often. Again, as we look at the Gospel of Luke and the context in which this passage occurs, we see that, know that Jesus really knew where he was going. He probably knew what was going to happen to him. And he knew that what was going to happen to him was a threat also to his disciples. Should his disciples meet the same fate that he would meet, what would become of the proclamation of the good news? Would there be any future in which the good news, the gospel, would ever be proclaimed? That was a hypothetical, really. And blessedly, it did not happen. But that it didn't happen didn't really change the nature of Jesus' very stringent and sobering caution about one's obligation to God, all of which gives us pause. This is really not hard to understand. We understand what Jesus is saying. It's just that we don't like what we understand. Okay, there are a couple of things here. Here in Luke, this obligation to God, standing above all other obligations, is presented in rather dire language and under very dire circumstances. Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, and he knew he would be executed. But our obligation to God is presented, fortunately, at other places in the Gospels in a somewhat more positive way. And that's where we can learn, I think, what's really being said. We can go back to Deuteronomy 6:4, to the Hear, O Israel, the Shema. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And this is further amplified by Jesus as the ultimate commandment by which we are to live. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Now, when viewed in Luke 10 and in Matthew and in Mark, where this is repeated, it feels a bit more positive. But when push comes to shove, Jesus' more dire, hyperbolic language in this morning's scripture is understood by us. And we have to ask ourselves, why should this be? Why should loving God take precedence over everything else in our lives? Doesn't that really seem like a kind of totalitarianism? And we who love democracy have absolutely no use for any kind of totalitarianism. What right does God have, after all, to make this kind of demand on us, especially as regards family? We have no problem seeing family as supremely important in our lives. From our most biological basis as human beings, entering into a relationship with another person and then creating a family, what really is more fundamental to our existence? We were created to recreate. How can what we were created to be within our own bodies and by our own bodies, how can that not be the most important thing in life? And yet the words coming from Jesus' mouth are saying there is one thing that is even more important, and that one thing is loving God. As we try to sort this out, we can perhaps ask ourselves the question, what does it really mean to love God? As you well know, the word love gets booted around an awful lot in our society today, and we have maybe a dozen different meanings for that particular word in our culture. I've had 2 weddings in the last 2 weeks. Love was a word that got used a lot in those ceremonies. I even gave a short homily in each of them about 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter. Love is something we profess for children, for spouses, for pets, even for hobbies. It's frequently the way we end conversation with family members. We say, "Love you," as everybody goes out the door. The love we have for God, I would submit, is a little bit different from the cultural interpretations we give that word. And it has, it seems to me, 2 distinctive elements. It has awe and it has respect. When I was in seminary, I think it was about 1,000 years ago, if I remember correctly, Paul Tillich, the theologian, was getting kicked around quite a bit, paid a lot of attention to. And Tillich, we discovered in our theology class, talked about the ground of being. The ground of being. That's a pretty sterile, academic sounding phrase that outside of the academy that causes us to kind of say, ho hum, what's next? But for Jean and me, it has come up again in some of our devotional readings of a morning, and I've had to think about it again after all these years. It helps me to look at this phrase and to think of ground to begin with. That, after all, is the thing we walk on. And it's really much more than that. You are a downtown church, but if you ever get out in the country, Gene and I went to Pawnee City last Sunday, you see that the ground, the soil, is a place where farmers plant seeds. And this time of year, the result of that is absolutely glorious, as we always celebrate when we drive down Highway 50 to Pawnee City. Especially to see those plantings, to see how they grow, and to think of the ground in which those seeds are planted. And then there's being, of course. To be or not to be, that is the question raised by Hamlet and in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Roughly speaking, being means to exist. Then if God is the ground of our being, doesn't that mean something like we are the seeds that God has planted in the ground? Loving God? Doesn't it mean something like we are planted in God? We grow in God. We are the fruit of God's earth. We are the crop that God has planted and is nurturing. To me, at least, this phrase, the ground of being, has finally begun to have some meaning. And if we love the life that God has planted, how can we not love God? There's a second reason. Too often this gets lost, I think, in the hatred and violence of Jesus' last days. There is the gospel. There is the good news. The crop that God plants, they cannot, humankind, destroy. Jesus was killed. He was buried in a tomb. And lo and behold, he grew again. We call it resurrection. The very relentlessness of God is yet another reason to love God. If Ms. Camille is correct, loving the God in whom we are planted, the God who constantly nurtures us with air, with energy, with light, with loving, with being planted and nurtured. Without that God, and without our being the plants God plants, there would be no family. There would be nothing else to love. Hating parents, hating spouses, hating children, brothers, sisters, that is extreme language. There's no two ways about it. It's a language which is even mitigated somewhat in some of the other Gospels. But I think we can understand what Jesus was saying. I think we can even carry this a little bit further. Without loving God, we can't really love our parents. We can't really love our spouses. We can't really love our children because they simply would not be. They are planted in God. They are grown by God. Wouldn't we love the God who has made them, who has made every creature on this earth? Why wouldn't we love that God, the God that makes all of our loving relationships possible? Jesus is saying in harsh language that we cannot love the ties that bind more than we love God. In a more positive way, we can say we must not be blinded by those ties. For after all, those ties are a gift from God, from the God who gives us everything, the God who is the very ground, the very soil in which we and everything and everybody we love, all of those things grow. We love that God because of the gifts that God has given us. Amen.